It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our guest speaker, Glen Miranker. Now, I've known Glen for quite a while. Glen has a wonderful career. He was offered a job by a friend named Steve Jobs, who was starting a little company called Next. And then Steve took Glen with him when he went up to another little company called Apple. And Glen eventually retired from Apple some years later, having become a collector. He had a great interest, needless to say for someone who knew computers, in cryptography. And Glen has a world-class collection of World War II Enigma machines. But that's not the only thing he collects. He does collect books. And Glen, tell us why.
I am very pleased to be here. And what I would like to talk about is why collect books? I mean, let's put aside for a moment the rewards of fellowship that I've found while on this crusade. Interesting people that I've met, and many of them have become my good friends. But when collectors such as myself talk about the thrill of the chase, usually we're talking about the pleasures of pursuit, the satisfactions of ownership, scrutinizing auction listings, poring through catalogs, visiting bookstores, antiquarian bookshops, used furniture stores. You know, those guys buy this furniture and they have the cases with the stuff left in it, and sometimes the stuff is interesting books. We do this all in the hope of tracking down a particular volume or finding a surprise gem through serendipity. But for me, questing for and finding interesting volumes alone is not why I find collecting so rewarding. First of all, most important, to collect books, you need to be a little out of balance. You know, it's collecting of any sort is certainly a psychological condition. Either you're afflicted or you're not. Now, I have no choice. I'm so afflicted. But for the bookish, the satisfaction of reading the whole book is unrivaled. And rather describing what I mean by that phrase, reading the whole book, let's look at a few examples from my collection. These volumes, I hope, will convince you that books have much to share with us beyond the words that are on their text block. I've chosen 4 particular books and the unexpected stories that they hold that I would like to share. One is a Beaton's Christmas Annual for 1887. The second book is a Sign of 4, United States Book Company printing. The third is a pirated edition of Study in Scarlet. And the last is a first edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in a Dust Jacket. Each of these, in a different way, is a portal into a time past. Each is an artifact that reveals the difficulty of creation and the twists and turns that a book took on its journey to its readers. I'd like to steal an idea from Michael Suarez, who runs the Rare Book School, among other things, runs the Rare Book School at UVA. He reminds us that authors don't write books. They create, depending on what time we're talking about, they may create manuscripts, they may create computer files, but from their creation to the book that we hold and we read is a very elaborate process that involves a community of people and also embodies, thoughts, sensibilities, machinations, and even crimes of previous owners or readers. And I live to unearth this information. Uncovering it is a task without end, which is perfect. The four books raise these particular books raise innumerable questions. For example, in the study, what was a Coburg's Mechanics Institute and Free Library, and why is this even an issue? How did Arthur Conan Doyle come to inscribe a pirated edition of his second Sherlock Holmes story, Study in Scarlet? And what is the connection between the copy of The Adventures in Jacket and a present-day murderer? How can a collector wrest answers to these questions from the books? These volumes represent more than stories to be read, more than bibliographic questions to be settled, more than books as collectibles. While most people read books for the story printed on the text block, confining yourself to the title story robs you of the context, the history, and the myriad other tales that a particular book has to share. That's what I mean when I talk about reading the whole book. To understand the community that brought them into existence, the writer, the publisher, the printer, distributor, among others, and identifying the people that the book was intended to inform and entertain. The intended audience is interesting to understand as well. And finally, to understand the particular idiosyncrasies of a particular volume. Again, I'll start with a magazine that made its way into my collection in 1987. By happy coincidence, that's exactly 100 years after its publication. It's a copy of the 1887 Beaton's Christmas Annual, each issue of which boasted that it featured 2 pieces of original literature. This issue contained A Study in Scarlet, the mystery in which, as you guys know, is Sherlock's first appearance. It was a bestseller. Slightly over 500,000 copies sold in 1887. But today, Beaton's is quite a rarity. There are only 34 copies known, and of those 34 copies, only 9 are in their original wrappers. They're among the most sought-after items for Sherlockian collectors. A decent copy sold in December 2010 for 6 figures. That's a far cry from the £25 that Conan Doyle was paid for the story. Not only was that paltry sum all the money he got, but it represented the sale of the copyright itself and all subsequent publishing rights. It was a naive misstep on Conan Doyle's part and a blunder that galled him for 35 years. He tried repeatedly to buy the rights back, but Wardlock wouldn't accommodate him. It was a mistake he would not make again. The Beaton's in my collection is not a pristine copy. Its wrappers came from it was without its wrappers, and the wrappers on it are now from the 1960 facsimile edition. But given its scarcity, any copy is to be prized. Furthermore, this copy bears a library stamp. I don't regard this stamp as a blot on the magazine. I think it adds mystery, and it presents a host of intriguing questions demanding answers. Among them, where is Coburg? What is a Mechanics Institute and Free Library? And why did the Mechanics Institute turf this book out? I purchased this Beaton's from Marv Epstein, a name that some of you may be familiar with. He was a mathematician at Bell Labs, and he assembled a spectacular detective fiction collection in the 60s and 70s. He had an absolutely encyclopedic knowledge about detective fiction. And also, he had a secret weapon. Remember, we're talking 60s and 70s. Most of you are old enough to remember there was a time, like the 60s and 70s, when phone calls cost money. Well, Marv, since he was at Bell Labs, had access to a Watts line. And boy, did he burn up the phone lines, calling stores everywhere. But Marv found this particular volume in the Argosy bookshop in New York after he had retired from book collecting. He gave up collecting and subsequently sold his collection towards the end of his life. He wanted to spend his last days traveling and wanted the funds for that. But he spotted this magazine and he couldn't help himself. But Marv could shed no further light on its provenance. So what tale does this library stamp hold for me, for the collector? I began first by looking for places named Coburg. A quick web search, revealed only a few cities in the English-speaking world with that name. There's a Coburg in Ontario, a Coburg in Oregon, but neither had a mechanics institute. In Australia, there used to be a municipality called Coburg, but in 1954, it merged with the city of Moreland. While Coburg, Australia had a mechanics institute, I found no evidence that it had ever had a Mechanics Institute free library. What's more, I'm embarrassed to say, that until that moment I hadn't known about I'd never heard of a Mechanics Institute, and I needed to remedy that. I learned that in the 19th century, a mechanic was a generic term for a skilled laborer, a tradesman, or an artisan. And credit for founding the Mechanics Institute goes to a Dr. George Berkman of the Andersonian Institute in Glasgow. In 1800, he gave a series of evening lectures to local mechanics about new technology. The lectures were extremely popular, and in no small part because Birkbeck offered them for free, and this was at a time when formal education was available only to the wealthy. This led to the formation of a growing number of facilities, around the British Isles, and they quickly spread to Commonwealth countries, particularly popular in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And they pioneered technical education, and they also formed the basis of these countries' modern public library systems. I was pleasantly surprised to discover that there's a Mechanics Institute library in San Francisco, where I live. A visit, though, shed no light on the Coburg Mechanics Institute library. I learned that there's no real affiliation among these institutes. But I did take home a pamphlet titled The Library of the Mechanics Institutes of Victoria, Australia by Francis Clancy. Unhappily, the pamphlet made no mention of the Mechanics Institute library in Coburg, or now Moreland. So I decided I needed some more information. I needed Miss Clancy herself. So in the middle of the night, San Francisco time, I tracked her down by phone. She in turn referred me to the president of the Coburg Historical Society, Mr. Laurie Burchell. And he and I had a very pleasant talk. It was a difficult talk because he didn't sound like Crocodile Dundee. I knew unequivocally that he was speaking English, but I really had to struggle. And I have no doubt he was having a similar amount of difficulty with my English, but we managed. Burchell was dubious about the Mechanics Institute library in Coburg. But after I sent him an email image, and I got a very satisfying email reply from him. He said, yes, in 1901, funds were raised for a Mechanics Institute in Coburg, which of course automatically entailed a library. Though the Mechanics Institute was formed and land was acquired, there was insufficient funds to build and buy books. I had always assumed that the library never got to be established, but the book you have proves otherwise. It must have operated for a time in some temporary accommodation. Thanks for the scan of the Institute's imprint in that volume. A couple of weeks later, I got another email from Burchell. Today, I visited one of the libraries of the University of Melbourne and examined the indices of the Sands and McDougall directories for 10 different years in the period 1900 to 1931, but unfortunately did not find any mention of the Coburg Mechanics Institute library, although many other such libraries were listed. We can only speculate that the Coburg's Mechanics Institute Committee bought and stamped some books but never actually established a library. This is not going well. However, a few months later, I got a third email from Mr. Burchell. Last week, I spent some time in the Moreland Historical Society archives. There were a large number of annual reports filed by the Coburg's Mechanic Institute. In the report for 1901, the secretary disclosed the addition of 9 books to the quote book collection, and listed among its holdings Beaton's Christmas Annual. So he goes on, the Coburg's Mechanics Institute certainly started the acquisition of libraries, even if none was established. So I now know a little more than when I started about my Beatons, but when it arrived in Australia, what befell it after acquiring the Mechanics Institute stamp, how it's made its way to New York City, all those questions are still to be answered. Happily, my long-distance collaborator, Mr. Burchell, stands ready to look for more evidence. Warmest thanks to Laurie for his assistance, another example of the generosity of bookish strangers. After a study in Scarlet, for the next 3 years, Conan Doyle turned his attention to his first love, Gothic novels, writing The Mystery of the Clumer and Micah Clarke, both set in 17th century England. Micah Clarke was his most successful work thus far, selling nearly 1,000 copies, and its success gave him entree to the literary world. On the strength of Micah Clarke and A Study in Scarlet, Conan Doyle was invited to dinner at the Langham Hotel in August 1889 by J.M. Stoddard, editor of the American magazine Lippincotts. Another young author was also invited to dinner, a fellow named Oscar Wilde. In Conan Doyle's words during dinner, a story was ordered and a turning point in my career was reached. Stoddard was in England doing preparatory work for Lippincotts to have a London-based edition as well, to exploit the British Isles market. Both these authors, Wilde and Conan Doyle, were commissioned. Each got commissioned a piece. Oscar Wilde, about 15 months later, delivered this book. You may have heard of it, A Picture of Dorian Gray. However, in 6 weeks after dinner, Conan Doyle had written the second Sherlock Holmes story, The Sign of Four, and it appeared in Lippincotts magazine in February of 1890. Lippincotts Monthly appeared both in the UK and US, where the detective's increasing popularity caught the attention of pirate publishers. Pirate publishers were these bandits in the United States. Usually they were really barely more than print houses that would publish books very inexpensively without acknowledging copyright, without paying the authors a nickel. The Sign of Four made its first U.S. appearance as a book in March of 1891 as a pirate imprint of Collier's called Once a Week Library. By the way, the first U.S. authorized edition book edition did not appear for another 2 years into 1893. A few other Sherlock Holmes stories made their first U.S. book appearance in unauthorized editions because of pirate publishers. For example, the first book appearance of Study in Scarlet, of A Case of Identity, are both in the Handy Classic series, and they precede first separate printings, legitimate first separate printings in the UK or the US. Take a look at a pirateer's prices. A Sign of Four was all but unaffordable to many. Only 12 cents if you subscribe to the Once a Week Library. 25 cents otherwise. There were and again, to put this in perspective, that's, a month's worth of bread for a book. But 12 cents is a tenth of that. Not even a 20th of that. There are a vast number of those pirates. For example, in my library, I have editions of The Sign of Four published by 48 different pirate publishers. That is just the sign of not just the sign of four, but the sign of four. They also published multiple editions as part of their marketing strategy. They had the Oxford edition, the Everyman's edition. So the actual number is staggering, but 48 different publishers, and surely there are others. Sorry for my confusion here. Like many other exploited authors, Conan Doyle was enraged by the theft of his material. He writes to this publisher, Hemingsley, who was the UK publisher that published The Sign of Four as soon as the copyright had reverted from Lippincott's back to Conan Doyle. He was smart this time. And he writes to Hemingsley, "It's rough on me, but I have no legal redress." His dismay is easy to understand. The books were sloppy productions, enriching the publishers but not the authors. But the truth is that these cheaply priced editions sold unbelievably well and made readers of people who had never before been able to afford a book. They had newspapers, they had the Bible, but 20 loaves of bread for a book was beyond most folks' needs. And so these pirate publishers popularized a great many authors: Mark Twain, J.M. Barrie, Stevenson, Waldo Emerson, Charles Dickens, Hardy, H.G. Wells. In no small measure, pirate publications contributed to literacy in the United States. And U.S. pirated editions helped turn Arthur Conan Doyle into a celebrity. For the Sherlockian collector, I think pirated editions are important for a number of reasons. Many have bibliographic significance, like the Collier's first book edition. As you will discover, they are also a source of delight. The list of pirateers and the books they published is not definitive, and unknown pirates still occasionally pop up. If there's any doubt about how authors felt about the situation, just take a look at Samuel Clemens' thoughts on copyright legislation. My favorite one is, whenever a copyright law is to be made or altered, then the idiots assemble. He was a very active lobbyist in these days to get copyright law made fair to authors and rational. So this brings us to our next example book. This is one of my favorite pirates. It's for what the edition tells us about the publisher, and for the signatures and ownership inscriptions tell us about one evening in Chicago, October 12th, 1894. It's a typical so-called quality hardbound pirate. The better than average paper, the binding is much better than average, and accordingly it carried a premium price. It was 50 cents. And however, it brought Conan Doyle no income. This edition was published and distributed by the United States Book Company. The United States Book Company was organized in 1890. It was incorporated in New Jersey with $3.25 million. That's $115 million today. And it was assembled by the pirateer John W. Lovell, who had the nickname, at least among his peers, as Book-a-Day Lovell. He had assembled the United States Book Company because he was tired of the business being so hard and making so little money, so he decided to absorb much of the competition. He acquired 22 existing imprints. And by 1895, the U.S. Book Company imprints accounted for half of the hardbound books published in the United States. This particular example is especially fascinating. First, it's warmly inscribed on the title page with the phrase, "Yours cordially," by an author who understandably hated pirate publishers. Why would Conan Doyle sign a pirated edition? When did he sign it and where? Well, we're going to explore this unanticipated story. I know of only 6 pirate Conan Doyle books that the author inscribed, and curiously, they were all signed when Conan Doyle was in Chicago. In 1894, you know, he made a speaking tour of the United States, and a great deal of his time was spent in the Midwest. All of them were signed in Chicago, and all of them are United States Book Company publications. On the front paste down, we can see an ownership signature. Harlow and Higinbotham. Who the heck is Higinbotham? Higinbotham was an important Chicagoan. He was a very successful businessman, a civic leader, philanthropist. He was a senior partner in the Marshall Field department store. He was a founder of the Field Museum. He was president of the World's Columbian Exposition held in Chicago in 1893 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the discovery of America. How did this book come to contain an inscription and a signature? Well, here's the story I've pieced together with some help from Fred Kittle, no longer with us, but a tremendous collector. And he wrote a monograph, Arthur Conan Doyle Visits Chicago. Also extensive consulting of contemporary Chicago newspapers at the Newberry Library, where Fred's collection now resides, and with the enthusiastic help of Newberry librarians such as Autumn Mather and Jenny Schwartzberg, without which I'm sure I would not have imagined to do the research on this book. Also, I owe a debt of thanks to Dan Poznansky, a New England collector who I'm sure everybody knows, who has a great deal of source material about Conan Doyle's Chicago visit. Conan Doyle first toured America in 1894. He stopped in Chicago 3 times. His first official undertaking was a talk on October 12th for Chicago's 20th Century Club entitled Facts and Fiction. He did his best not to talk about Sherlock, but typically the demands of the crowd deflected him from his chosen topic. The club met in a bijou theater on the 3rd floor of Harlow Higinbotham's Michigan Avenue mansion. It was there that the author inscribed 3 books for Higinbotham: Study in Scarlet, The Sign of 4, and Micah Clark, all pirated editions. The bookseller James Cummins sold the 3 books in 1991. My inscribed copy came from an elderly Chicago collector who's asked that his identity be kept confidential. After Conan Doyle's talk, Higinbotham gave a dinner to honor his guests, also in the Higinbotham mansion. Thanks to contemporary newspaper reports, we know that Higinbotham famously misspoke in toasting his honored guest, referring to him as Canon Doyle. As a result, Doyle was referred to by the press by various religious honorifics for the balance of his American trip. I surmise that Higinbotham purchased the 3 books especially for the occasion. Why would I think so? Well, if you take a closer look at the ownership signature, it's dated the very day of Conan Doyle's lecture at the Higinbotham home, October 12th. Here is a picture of the Chicago Daily News the day after, on the 13th, summarizing this cosmic social event in the town of Chicago. A reasonable question is, how do we know that the Higinbotham signature is correct? Well, I mentioned that Higinbotham was president of the 1893 exposition, Columbian Exposition. One of his duties, honors, was that his signature was printed on the admissions tickets. So a little search on eBay, and I turned up and they're quite plentiful, by the way. I turned up an admissions ticket for the Columbian Exposition, and I think a comparison of the signatures is convincing enough. Well, Conan Doyle's planned 3-week visit to the United States lasted 65 days. He returned home on December 15th. He enjoyed his trip to the New World and the fruits of his fame, which were due to the Sherlock Holmes service. I'm running quite long, I can tell. So, so let me sort of blast through a couple of things here. One of the other class of pirates is, this is an example thereof, the imprint is of a department store. You can tell from the text block it was in fact printed by Donahue, but and these are reasonably common. I have so far found 7 examples of pirated books where the imprint is Strawbridge and Clothier, Montgomery Ward, and so forth, with the department store's imprint on it. And in those days, department stores had book departments, so it's sort of plausible. But this particular one is one of my favorites because it was done for this company, Clark and Close, where every single page of the book has these 3 quips on the margins. We have suits and skirts to burn, but we would rather sell them to you. Every page. But let me just jump. So the publications, however, the publications that changed Conan Doyle's fortunes were not his Holmes novels, The Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four. The Study in Scarlet, of course, had extremely good sales, but that was because it was part of Beaton's. The Sign of Four, official publications, sold fewer than 1,000 copies in its first year. But the 12 Sherlock Holmes short stories that appeared in the Strand magazine, that made him and Sherlock a household name. And these 12 stories were collected into a book. Everybody here knows this, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and that's the book I would like to take a look at next. The first edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes sold some 10,000 copies. And the short stories ignited sales of Conan Doyle's earlier titles. Within 1 week of the appearance of The Adventures, 3,000 copies of The Sign of Four were sold in the UK. That's 3 times as many, more than 3 times as many copies as the entire print run of the first edition, just a couple years earlier. There are many, many copies of The Adventures that are intriguing. For example, this one. If we look on the title page, it's inscribed with Conan Doyle's kindest regards, October 6th, 1892. Okay, but a quick check reveals that October 6th is 8 days before the book's publication date. The rest is just, I think, logical speculation. I think this copy is what today we would call an author's sample copy. But rather than dwell on this one, I'd like to show you another copy of The Adventures, if I may. Yeah. Boy, did I get ahead of myself. My apologies. This is, by the way, this book, let me go back. This is the only known copy of the first edition, first state of The Adventures in the Dust Jacket. Astoundingly fresh and beautiful, isn't it, for a 130-year-old volume? Where has it been all this time? For me, this book has all the elements a bibliomaniac could ask for. Bibliographic rarity, impeccable condition, twists and turns of provenance, and even murder, as we'll see. Until half a century ago, no one actually knew whether the first English adventures had ever been issued in a dust jacket. The memoirs, yes, but the adventures in jacket had been elusive. There was a second state adventures in jacket in the collection of Lou David Feldman, a formidable bookman who ran the LDF bookstore in New York City from 1935 to 1970. And he did much to establish detective fiction in the first tier of collectible books. In the 1957 annual dinner of the BSI Irregulars, Feldman tantalized members with photographs of his jacketed copies of the adventures and the memoirs. Here is what LDF had to say. For 20 years, collectors have asked us, did the 1892 Adventures London Noons appear in dust wrapper? Our answer was invariably the same: we don't know. The Adventures you see here is the first and only dust wrapper we've ever seen on the book. Published in 1893, it bears a legend on the title page, and so is the second edition. He refers to these days, we refer to this as the second state. He called it the second edition. The flimsy dust wrapper is a pale green to match the brilliant covers. Please note, if you can, that the legend Southampton Street appears in the rectangle near the top of the vignette on the front cover. Please note further that we have successfully resisted the almost overwhelming temptation to embrace this as a brilliant copy of the first edition with a dust wrapper. The bibliographic truth must out. So according to LDF, the 1893 first edition second state, which is what he called the second edition, had been issued with a jacket, and the 1894 first edition of the memoirs had been issued with a jacket. He owned them. But even LDF couldn't be positive about the existence of a jacket for the 1892 first edition first state of the Adventures. Now, collectors among you will know that when you hear the phrase according to LDF, we hear the ring of bibliographic authority. Feldman devoted himself to Sherlockian rarities, and his success in turning up astounding material remains unmatched. He was responsible for discovering 6 short story manuscripts, the Valley of Fear manuscript, a great many first and early edition copies, and at least 4 Beaton's Christmas annuals in wrappers. He also sold books in the 1960s for aging Conan Doyle, the author's son and literary executor. But Sherlockian collectors are ever hopeful. In the spring of 1891, Mark Heim of Biblioctopus Antiquarian Books was visiting J. Stephen Lawrence Rare Books of Chicago, and he was considering whether to buy a small collection of books recently acquired by the Stephen Lawrence book owner, Larry Konetka. And then there was what at the time became known as the book, the Blue Book. It had a rather stratospheric price, but eventually Heim sold it to a Utah bookseller named Mark Hoffman. I imagine that many of you are familiar with the name Mark Hoffman. He is notoriously known as the Mormon forger. At the time, Hoffman was assembling a children's literature collection for his wife and himself. So Conan Doyle's Adventures of Sherlock Holmes joined Lewis Carroll and L. Frank Baum, among other things, on Hoffman's shelves. It was said by the FBI man who eventually jailed him that he's the best forger who has ever been caught. Hoffman was absolutely a genius. Absolute genius. He forged a large and still unknown number of texts and signatures. He successfully mimicked the handwriting of Emily Dickinson, Mark Twain, Abraham Lincoln, Nathan Hale, John Hancock. and it fooled the very best in the business. His most numerous and most infamous forgeries were hitherto unknown documents that were central to the beliefs and history of the Mormon Church, which Mark Hoffman then sold to the church. Now, he was clever. Not only did he find an eager customer for the material that he was finding, but he was careful to put something embarrassing to the church orthodoxy in most of the things that he found. So the church, of course, bought them and sent them down into the basement, so they did not receive very much scrutiny. Well, in the mid-'80s, Hoffman's convoluted business dealings and mounting pressure to produce new discoveries, he'd already accepted a substantial prepayment. This all began to unravel. Now, nobody knows what his motivation for sure was, but what he did is he constructed 3 bombs, and in November of 1985, he blew up 3 people. The common speculation is to take attention off of things so that he could spend the time creating his discoveries. His first 2 victims were important in the Mormon hierarchy, and they were killed instantly. The 3rd victim was Hoffman himself, no doubt an accident. He was grievously injured, but he eventually recovered and stood trial. These are just a few of the headlines about his identification, arrest, and trial. At the beginning, Mormon researcher injured in 3rd Utah bombing. They eventually figured out he was not he was a victim, but he was a victim of his own plans. And then eventually he was convicted. Forger who killed 2 must spend life in prison, board rules. Now, given that he principally defrauded the Mormon Church, given that the 2 people he killed were Mormon dignitaries, and given that he's in prison in the Utah State Pen, I don't think he's getting out on parole. Just my thought. This is where Hoffman is presently living. He was actually relocated from Orem, Utah State to this state, and I took a casual look. This is apparently where Utah likes to keep their elderly inmates. He's presently serving 2 life sentences. When Hoffman's forgeries came to light during his trial, in part to recompense his creditors, his personal collection was confiscated and sold. And I think it's ironic that the bookseller selected to dispose of Hoffman's collection was Mark Heim, dealer who had originally sold the adventures to Hoffman. I've attempted to correspond with Mark Hoffman, by the way. Just sort of a bread and butter letter. You know, why did this particular book strike you as appropriate for your collection? And the first letter came back with this unhelpful stamp on it, undeliverable about commitment name and commitment number. So, of course, I get on the web and poke around, and I discover that in the Utah state penal system, the only thing you can find out is where to send a resume to apply for a job. California, you can find out an inmate's mother-in-law's favorite flavor of ice cream, but in Utah, nothing. So I was at dinner at a bar one evening with a friend of mine, a fellow named Gordon Underwood, who was a fairly senior guy in the California state penal system. And I was whining about my failure, and he said, "Give me the letter." So I brought him the letter, and then about a week later he said, "Here's his commitment name and here's his commitment number." Well, I was very, very excited. So I wrote him a second time. Contents not authorized, return to sender. I got very excited because shortly before, there was a significant time lag, maybe a month or something from when I mailed it, something of that order. But there happened to be a story in the newspaper that the FBI had discovered that Hoffman was communicating in code with people on the outside, trying to organize the assassination of some of the jury members and the judge, etc. So I got really excited. They said maybe they think I'm trying to send him a message, and maybe the FBI is going to be knocking on my door as a suspicious character. It's far more prosaic than that. I was chatting with somebody who knows about these things. He says, well, what was in your communication? I said, well, my letter, and I included a self-addressed stamped envelope because I thought it might be a chore for him to get postage. And he says, you can't do that. And I said, why not? And he says, well, they're worried that there'll be contraband hidden under the stamp. I said, really? Well, you know, a dot of LSD or something. I said, okay. So I tried a third time. This time I pulled out all the stops. I'm becoming very familiar with Mark Hoffman, and I found out that he was particularly accessible by women. So I had the letter I was going to send him copied out by a lady down the street, so it was in a woman's hand. And I had the letter come from Glenda Miranker. And there was no self-addressed stamped envelope. Haven't heard a thing. My friend Gordon has been helpful. I haven't followed up. He said the next thing to do is write to his case officer. And of course, Gordon had his case officer for me. I have not made a fourth try. Yeah, right. So we've traveled down the path here of 4 Sherlock Holmes books. Study in Scarlet from an institution that was thought to have never existed. A pirated sign of the 4, nevertheless inscribed by Conan Doyle. And a seemingly unique copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes with murky origins and previously owned by a murderer. As I suggested early on, there's a susurration from my bookshelves, a constant hum of questions to be answered. Whispering is out of range for most people, but it's perfectly audible to me. And very alluring, and says, read the whole book. Happily, thanks to generous and untiring librarians, friends, colleagues, researchers, collectors, others touched by the gentle madness, I dwell on the possibility, the hope, of ferrying out the backstories and personalities that adhere to my books. Reading a book's story is only the beginning. Reading the whole book is a much richer experience. Thank you.
Would you like to answer questions?
I would be delighted to answer questions.
Any questions?
The answers may be I don't know, but Michael.
Glenn, do you inscribe your books with your name?
I do when asked.
No, I mean.
Oh, no. I
Is
put.
your library-
No.
Is it useful for the future of these books so they
What-
can trace their provenance?
What? Absolutely. And what I am going to do, and it's procrastination on my part, I'm going to have a book plate made, and oh. The question was, do I inscribe my books in order to continue this path of provenance? And great question. What I intend to do, and it's on my list of procrastinated tasks, is I'm going to have some book plates made, and I'm going to lay them in. I'm not, if the subsequent owner wants to glue them in, that's their business. But yes, they will bear my record of my ownership.
Anybody else? Okay, you want to do show and tell?
Peter asked me to bring a manuscript to share with you guys. And I elected to, we have to find a place which is 2 arms length away from liquids, if you don't mind.
I can take down the
that would work. So some of you may know that I'm blessed. I'm fortunate. I do have some manuscript material, and much of it is on exhibition right now. But I do have at home the manuscript for the Greek interpreter, and I acquired that manuscript because as a story, I think it's a very good story. But as a story, it particularly tickled me because other than casual throwaway references, it's the only story that features Mycroft, and also it's the only story where we get from Holmes's mouth stories about his familial background. And so the family associations are special. You know, they're not common in the rest of the canon, and so I wanted to have the manuscript. As they go, it is physically rather plain, rather uninteresting. Some of the other manuscripts, Conan Doyle,
uninteresting manuscript.
as a physical object. I profess it as a physical object. As these manuscripts go, well, yeah, yeah. Oh, you have no idea. I mean, after this, if I can, there's another foam baggie. And after this, there's a slipcase. Actually, you know, I've gone through TSA with Enigma machines. The only interest they show is to bring it back here, and they did the wiping it up. They were otherwise uninterested. I figured this has got to be a suspicious looking. So when I say physically, most of the extant manuscripts were Conan Doyle did in exercise books, and a goodly number of them have been bound. And when they were bound, many of them have additional materials. Many of them were bound in with the original covers, and some of them also have, in addition to that, extra pages. Conan Doyle would take a piece of paper and write a title page to bind in with them. And so besides the manuscript itself, there's some physical, I think they have some additional physical interest. This is simply the pages. That's all I meant when I said it's physically not among the more interesting manuscripts. So please, come up, take a look. If
Do you happen to know how this manuscript managed to, well, this is, most of the manuscripts in that particular series don't exist anymore. Do you happen to know how this one happened to survive for 150 years?
I have to confess, I have not put any time into researching the manuscript at all. I've been I won't say distracted, but sufficiently distracted, so I can answer almost no questions about it except the story itself.
Next meeting.
By next meeting, I will be as thorough as I can manage in 1 year.
Do you know the provenance of the?
Well, the previous owner was a real estate. The most immediate previous owner was a real estate developer in Southern California, and he's not very communicative. So I either have to strike him in a good mood, or find out about it in other means. I figure the best thing to do is to buy Randall's stock a dinner or 2 or 3, and then everything will be known.
Glenn is not going to pass these pages around.
No, you have to please, if you're more than welcome to touch it, even if your hands are clean.